Two little twin girls, their small bodies bruised and their clothes torn, shivered outside the cold hospital walls. One lay unconscious, fragile as a feather, barely clinging to life, while the other, trembling, begged anyone nearby for help, her tiny voice swallowed by the indifference of the world. Doors remained closed. Faces turned away. It was as if the universe itself had denied them the right to be seen. And then, just when it seemed there was no one left to care, a sleek car pulled up silently. Behind the wheel sat a man whose life had known wealth and influence, but beside him, in the passenger seat, was a German shepherd with eyes that seemed to pierce through the gray haze of human neglect. Eyes that could see what others would not. What happened next would shatter hearts and rebuild them in ways no one could have expected. But before we follow their story, pause for a moment. Comment below where you're watching from. Then step with us into this tale. Mapleford, a quiet seaside town, was gripped by winter. A pale, icy mist rolled off the harbor, curling around old buildings and rattling their weathered shutters. The salt air bit sharply at cheeks and hands, and gulls cried faintly as the wind swept through narrow streets. On the northern edge of town, away from the tourist-filled boardwalks, stood a two-story house that time seemed to have forgotten. Its paint peeled in wide strips, its windows boarded, the porch sagging as though weighed down by decades of neglect. Once, this modest home had offered shelter to a struggling single mother and her twin daughters. Now, it was little more than a shell, left by a landlord who no longer cared, a place to hide from the elements rather than a home. Inside, 8-year-old Leia Hawthorne knelt beside a thin, worn mattress in the dim corner of a cold, unheated room. Her honey-brown hair, tied back in a loose ponytail, escaped in damp strands that clung to her flushed cheeks. Her coat was frayed at the edges, her dark hazel eyes too old for her years, constantly flicking between her sister and the cracked window where the wind hissed through. Beside her lay Sophie, her identical twin, her small frame pale and almost gray. Her shallow, uneven breaths trembled with each rise and fall of her chest. A faded yellow sweater far too big hung from her shoulders, sleeves dangling over tiny hands. She clutched a thin quilt to her chest, the fabric doing little to stop the cold from seeping in. Leia pressed a hand to her sister's forehead, feeling the heat, the weakness that made her heart lurch. "It's okay, Sophie," she whispered, though her voice shook, betraying the fear she tried to hide. They had survived storms before, literal storms, life storms, but Sophie had never looked this fragile. The medicines their mother once bought were gone. The cupboards held only nearly empty cans. Since their mother's death 2 months ago, the world had stopped knocking on their door, leaving only the landlord's occasional, indifferent visits to lock the rooms. Now only this one space remained accessible. Through the grime-streaked glass of the window, Leia saw the slick, icy streets outside. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She tugged on her faded backpack. Inside were only a few possessions: a half-full bottle of water, a cracked paperback, and a threadbare scarf. Carefully, she slid her arms beneath Sophie, lifting her onto her back. Though the weight was small, it pressed heavily on Leia's thin frame, carrying not just her sister but the burden of responsibility and fear. Stepping out into the freezing wind was a gamble, leaving the fragile safety of the room for the uncertain world outside. The streets were nearly empty, save for a man sweeping in front of a shuttered bakery who didn't glance up. Leia's worn boots scuffed over icy cracks in the sidewalk. Sophie's soft moan against her shoulder quickened her pace. A few blocks away, she spotted the dim, familiar glow of the Mapleford Community Clinic. Inside the clinic, Dr. Evelyn Sharp sorted through charts at the reception desk. In her mid-50s, she had a sharply angled face, silver-streaked dark hair tied into a tight bun, and glasses perched low on her nose. Her reputation in town was formidable, efficient, strict, and unwavering in her adherence to policy. To Evelyn, rules were the foundation of the clinic. Sentimentality was a weakness she had no time for. Laya pushed open the glass door, the chime ringing softly. The receptionist, a thin man with weary eyes, looked up first. "Can I help you?" he asked. "My sister," Laya said, shifting to reveal Sophie's limp form. "She can't breathe right, please." Evelyn approached, her expression cool, almost indifferent. "Do you have insurance, identification, or any documentation?" "No," Laya said, panic flashing. "She's sick. She needs a doctor." Evelyn's face did not change. "I'm sorry. Without proper paperwork, we cannot admit her. It's policy." Ice-cold words that slammed into Laya's chest. She faltered under Sophie's weight. "She's not breathing right," Laya's voice cracked. "Take her to Seaside Medical Center," Evelyn replied, already turning away. "They handle emergencies." The receptionist's eyes softened, but he remained still, as though bracing for something beyond his control. Laya turned, swallowing the lump in her throat. The chime of the door echoed cruelly behind her as the freezing wind cut through her coat. Sophie's head lolled against her shoulder, breaths shallow, trembling. Laya did not cry. Tears changed. Nothing. She kept walking, uncertain where to go next. Across town, along the empty winter shoreline, Ethan Cole walked steadily, a German shepherd at his side. Ethan, in his early 60s, carried an aura that drew attention, not for wealth, which he wore quietly, but for the weight in his eyes, a presence carved from loss and discipline. Silvered hair framed a face lined by years of decisions and grief. His lean frame moved with purpose, coat collar turned up against the wind, one gloved, hand gripping the leash, the other in his pocket. Ranger, the German shepherd, moved silently beside him, thick coat brushing against the cold air. Every sound reached his alert ears, every movement gauged with precise awareness. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the sea, but his mind was far from the waves. Memories of Emily, his daughter, her laughter, her small hand in his, haunted him still. Memories of the night she had died, waiting for care that had not come. A faint, muffled sob drifted on the wind. Ranger stiffened, muscles taut. The dog's gaze met Ethan's, tugging lightly, insistent. "What is it?" Ethan murmured, already following. Through the narrow streets, past shuttered shops and faded holiday garlands, the sobs grew clearer. They rounded a corner and saw her. A girl no older than 8, carrying her limp twin on her back. The girl stopped under a street lamp, the light revealing wind-chapped cheeks, exhaustion etched in every line of her small face. She adjusted her sister, breath visible in the frigid air. Ranger stepped forward first, low tail wagging, head tilted. "I see you." Ethan approached slowly. "Hey there," he said softly, warm despite the chill. "Is she hurt?" The girl's eyes met his, not fearful, only exhausted. "She's sick. We went to the clinic." Her voice faltered. Ethan needed no more. He took in the smaller child's shallow breaths, her trembling fingers. His chest tightened with a raw, familiar ache. "Come on," he said gently. "I'll take you both to the hospital." The girl hesitated only a moment, then nodded. Ethan opened the SUV's back door. Ranger leapt in first, settling against the seat. He lifted Sophie carefully into Laya's arms, then climbed in himself. Engine turned over, headlights cutting. Through mist. Inside, Laya held Sophie close, forehead to shoulder, eyes fixed, afraid to blink. Ranger curled beside them, warm against the chill. The hospital ahead, a fragile thread of hope, stretched forward. Ethan's knuckles were white on the wheel, every muscle taut as he drove, carrying them toward the only place that might open its doors. The sight of the girl's face, gaunt but stubborn, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet refusing to close, had pulled something deep from his chest. Something he had thought buried beneath the years. Emily's eyes had once looked the same on the night he'd sat helpless in a waiting room that never opened its doors in time. The memory gnawed at him now, urging his foot harder on the gas. They drove, in silence through Mapleford's quiet streets, where holiday lights still hung limp across darkened shop fronts. A grocery store sign flickered overhead, its neon hum the only sound, besides the low growl of the engine and Sophie's faint wheeze. A mile away, in the bright, orderly halls of Seaside Medical Center, Grace Holloway adjusted the strap of her surgical mask as she stepped into the nurse's station. At 28, Grace carried herself with a calm professionalism that belied the sleepless nights etched faintly beneath her hazel eyes. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a loose braid, a few rebellious strands, escaping to frame her face. She wore the pale blue scrubs of the evening shift, a stethoscope draped around her neck. Grace had been with Seaside for just under a year, having left a bustling city hospital for the quieter pace of Mapleford. She had told her colleagues she needed a change, but in truth, she had been looking for a place where the noise in her own head might soften. What she hadn't expected was how often silence in a small town could mean neglect. A radio call crackled through the station. Possible pediatric emergency inbound. Unconfirmed details. Patient arriving by private vehicle. Grace straightened. Pen paused. Over the intake form she'd been working on. From the corner, one of the older nurses muttered, "Heard. It's those two kids again. No parents, no paperwork. Social services haven't touched it." Grace frowned again. The nurse shrugged, eyes back. On her screen. "That's the rumor. Couple of times people saw them around the old quarter. The little one's sick. No one's done a thing about it." Grace tapped her pen against the clipboard. Rumors had a way of growing teeth in a small town. But there was something in the nurse's tone, a resigned acceptance that unsettled her more than the words themselves. Back in the SUV, Ranger shifted, his ear spricking toward the road ahead. Laya noticed his posture and instinctively reached out, her fingers brushing the soft fur along his neck. He didn't move away. "You're safe now?" Ethan said quietly, catching her gaze in the rearview mirror. Layla hesitated, then asked, "Will they let us in?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "They will tonight." As they pulled into the hospital's cupboard. "Drop off!" The automatic doors slid open to reveal the glow of the lobby. Grace was already there, clipboard in hand, scanning the arriving vehicle. When she saw Ethan step out, tall in his long coat, followed by the sight of Laya carrying Sophie with a dog close at their heels, she felt an unspoken urgency settle over her. She approached quickly, her voice calm but firm. "Let's get her inside. How long has she been like this?" "Hours," Laya said before Ethan could answer. She couldn't breathe right. "The clinic." She stopped herself, glancing at Ethan. Grace's eyes flickered understanding more than the words revealed. "Follow me." Inside, there was warm, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic. The receptionist glanced up, then down at his screen, as if accustomed to letting others decide who belonged. Grace led them past the waiting area and into a curtained exam bay. Motioning for Laya to set Sophie gently on the bed, Ethan stepped aside, letting the medical team move in. Ranger sat at his heel, eyes fixed on Laya, as if ensuring she wasn't left behind. Grace quickly clipped a pulse oximeter onto Sophie's finger, her brows knitting at the numbers. "We need oxygen now," she called, her voice cutting clean through the ambient noise. As the mask was fitted over Sophie's face, Laya clung to the rail of the bed, watching her sister's chest rise and fall under the influence of the steady flow of air. Grace spoke to her in a softer tone. "You can stay here with her. I'll need to ask some questions later." "Okay." Laya nodded. still gripping the rail. Ethan moved closer to the foot of the bed, his eyes never leaving the twins. In the corridor outside, Grace stepped aside to page the on-call pediatrician, but her thoughts kept circling back to the words she'd heard earlier. 2 kids. No one's touched it. She had seen enough in her previous job to know what those words meant. A case that had slipped between the cracks or been pushed there, and those cracks were wide enough to swallow children whole. As she returned to the bay, she caught Ethan's expression, not just concern, but recognition, like a man seeing ghosts in the living. The weight of it struck her, though she didn't yet know why. Ethan looked up, met her eyes. "Thank you for helping them." Grace shook her head. "We're just getting started." In the dim hum of the monitors, with Ranger lying like a sentinel at the bedside, the hospital walls seemed to hold their breath. Outside, the cold pressed against the glass. But for the first time that night, the door had opened. The sliding doors of Seaside Medical Center whispered shut behind them, sealing out the salt-bitten wind. The warmth inside was almost disorienting after. The cold. The overhead lights glaring on polished floors. Laya tightened her arms around Sophie, who stirred faintly against her shoulder. Ranger patted in close beside Ethan, his nails clicking softly on the tile. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. They approached the reception desk where a man in his 40s sat behind a monitor, his sandy hair combed neatly but with deep lines of fatigue under his pale blue eyes. His name tag read, "Paul Simmons Admissions." He glanced up, saw Laya's burden, and his face softened, but then his gaze slid to Ethan and back to his screen, the way someone might look at an incoming problem they weren't sure they could solve. "Sir, are you the child's legal guardian?" Paul asked, his tone polite but cautious. Ethan shook his head. "Number I found them in the street. She needs immediate attention." Paul hesitated. "Without a parent or legal guardian present, we can't officially admit her without clearance," from Ethan's voice cut in, low and steady. "Then give me whatever forms you need. Waivers, legal releases. I'll sign them all. But if we wait, she might not be breathing in 10 minutes. Paul's hands hovered over the keyboard. He glanced toward the hallway, perhaps hoping someone else would make the decision for him. Ethan leaned forward, his silver-templed hair catching the light, felines around his mouth deepening. "Paperwork or not, this is an emergency. The law's not going to save her if we stand here." Paul exhaled slowly, then reached for a thick clipboard, stacked with forms. "All right, sign here, here, and initial these." While Ethan scrolled his name across the pages, Laya stood close to the desk, shifting her weight to keep Sophie steady. Ranger positioned himself directly in front of the desk between the family and the open lobby. His ears were forward, his body alert but calm, as if guarding an invisible line no one was allowed to cross without his approval. When Ethan slid the completed forms back, Paul picked up the phone. "Pediatric emergency in Bay 2, he called, his voice firmer now. Grace Holloway appeared moments later, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who knew each second mattered. "We're ready," she said, her hazel eyes locking on Sophie. "Follow me." As Ethan and Laya walked alongside Grace toward the curtained exam area, Ranger stayed close to Laya's hip. Inside, a young resident in green scrubs began checking Sophie's vitals, the beeping monitor quickly registering her weak oxygen saturation. Grace adjusted the flow on the oxygen mask, her hands gentle but sure. "We'll take care of her," she told Laya, who didn't move from the bedside. Once Sophie was settled with the medical team, Grace stepped into the hallway and motioned for Paul to bring up the patient's registration record. "Let's see what we're working with," she murmured. Paul turned his monitor so she could view it. The entry for Sophie, and by extension, Laya, was sparse. No insurance, no emergency contacts, no current address, except a line for Hawthorne, 217 Doside Lane. Grace frowned. She knew Dockside Lane, a cluster of aging rentals near the North Docks. "That building's been half-boarded for months," she said. "Whose lease was it?" Paul scrolled. Under the mother's name, Elena Hawthorne. "Lease terminated 6 weeks ago. Property marked as vacant by the landlord." Grace's frown deepened. Vacant? That place had a complaint last year. Hazardous living conditions. Black mold, faulty wiring. I remember the airport, but she stopped. She remembered it too well because it had landed on a shared community health bulletin and then simply disappeared. No follow-up inspection, no outreach. Paul looked uneasy. If they were still there after the lease ended, they had no legal residence, which means they slipped through the system. Grace finished, her voice taut. She could already imagine the file trail. A complaint passed to housing, forwarded to social services, then lost in a sea of non-urgent flags until it faded into the background. And now here were the consequences. Wrapped in a faded yellow sweater and barely holding on, she straightened, her mind clicking into motion. She'd worked in a city ER long enough to know that sometimes saving a patient meant more than stabilizing their vitals. It meant digging into the why. If these girls had been abandoned by the system once, nothing would stop it from happening again, unless someone pulled the right threads. Now, back in the bay, Ethan stood near the head of the bed while a nurse adjusted Sophie's blankets. Laya had finally sat down, her legs tucked under the chair, her hand resting lightly on her sister's arm. Ranger lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never straying far from her face. Grace returned, clipboard in hand, and met Ethan's gaze. There was a question there, silent, waited, but now wasn't the time. She gave a brief update on Sophie's condition. Oxygen was helping, vitals still unstable but improving. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "Da, whatever you need, I'll handle the rest." As Grace left to order additional tests, she glanced once more at the file on her clipboard. 217. Dockside Lane glared back at her in faded ink. She tucked it under her arm, already deciding she wasn't going to let this address fade into another dead end. Outside the bay, the hospital hummed with its usual rhythm. But here in this small corner, the rule had already been bent, if not broken. And for one child's breath, and perhaps for something larger, that decision might just change everything. By morning, the thin gray light creeping through the blinds of Sophie's hospital room felt softer than the night before. The steady beeping of the monitor had slowed to a more reassuring rhythm, and the pale blue of her lips had faded back to a healthier color. She was still sleeping, her chest rising and falling under the warm hospital blanket. But the tightness in Laya's shoulders had eased just slightly. She sat in the chair beside the bed, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes moving between Sophie and the half-open door as if she were standing guard. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, hands in the pockets of his tailored charcoal coat, watching. The sisters in silence. His relief was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the first step. Sophie was stable now, but the doctor's words still echoed in his mind. She'll need continued care for at least a few weeks, longer if complications arise. Weeks meant resources. It meant stability. Two things Leia clearly hadn't known in some time. He stepped out into the hall and pulled out his phone. "Rachel Bloom," he said quietly when the call connected. Rachel was in her early 40s with sharp, brown eyes behind rectangular glasses, her auburn hair always pulled back for efficiency. She had built her reputation as a human rights attorney by taking on cases that others found too tangled to win. "Ethan, you don't usually call this early." Rachel's voice was low but alert. "I've got 2 children who've fallen completely through the cracks. No parents, no paperwork. I need you to find out why and how to make sure they don't disappear back into whatever mess they came from." Rachel didn't hesitate. Names: Laya and Sophie Hawthorne. He paused. "Start with their last known address." 217 Doside Lane. Rachel hummed softly, already typing. I'll dig, but you know me, Ethan. I'm not just looking for names. I'm looking for the trail. Someone failed them. That's exactly what I want to know, he said before ending the call. Back in the room, Laya's eyes followed him cautiously as he re-entered. Where's Sophie's coat? She asked suddenly. In the back of my car, Ethan said. Why? I want it and our bag, she said quickly, almost defensively. We left some things behind. Ethan studied her for a moment before nodding. Then we'll get them. Ranger will come too. It was late morning when they left the hospital. The sea air was damp, carrying the smell of the tide as they drove toward Dockside Lane. Laya sat in the front passenger seat, RER's head resting on her knee, his dark eyes glancing between her and the road ahead. Ethan had the sense the dog was measuring her, much the way he measured anyone new in his circle. Dockside Lane was quiet, the kind of street where salt had worn down the paint on every door, and the porches sagged from years without repair. The two-story rental at 217 stood at the far end, its siding warped and one window boarded. Ethan parked at the curb, stepping out into the chill. Ranger trotted ahead, tail raised but not wagging, his nose working the air. Laya moved quickly up, the front steps, but as she reached for the door frame, she froze. The knob bore fresh scratches, metal exposed beneath the chipped paint. That wasn't there before, she murmured. Ethan came to stand beside her, his eyes narrowing. Looks like someone tried to force the lock. Ranger sniffed along the base of the door, then around to the side window. He stopped abruptly, ears stiff, and gave a low, rumbling growl. Ethan put a hand on Lila's shoulder. Well, be quick. Grab what you need. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew, and the cold crept in through unseen cracks. In the corner of the single unlocked room sat a small pile of belongings, a threadbare backpack, a child's sketchbook, and Sophie's faded yellow sweater. Leia crouched to gather them, her movements quick and precise, as if she feared someone might appear at any moment. When they stepped back outside, Ranger kept his position between them and the street until they were inside the SUV. Ethan drove away, his mind already shifting to the next call he would make to Rachel. Whoever had tried to get inside that house, he needed to know who and why. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Grace Holloway sat across from Deputy Mark Jensen in a small corner booth at a diner that smelled of coffee and fried eggs. Mark was in his late 30s with a solid build and short-cropped brown hair. His uniform was neat, but there was a weariness in his blue eyes that came from years of responding to the kind of calls no one else wanted. Grace stirred her coffee slowly. I've been looking into the girls Ethan brought in last night. Their file lists 217 Dockside Lane as their address, but the lease ended weeks ago. There's also an old complaint about unsafe living conditions. No one followed up. Mark leaned back, frowning. Not surprising, but not acceptable either. That's supposed to trigger an in-person check. That's why I'm here, Grace said. I think someone was around them before. Someone who shouldn't have been. The name Carl Vance came up when I asked a few quiet questions. Ring any bells? Mark's jaw tightened. Yeah, Vance used to live near Dockside. Mid-4s, worked odd jobs, nothing steady. He's been on our radar before for neglect and suspected abuse of minors, but we never had enough tow charge him. You're telling me he had contact with those girls? From what I've gathered, he was their babysitter when their mother worked nights, Grace replied, the bitterness in her tone making the term sound like an insult. If he's still around, I want to know. And if he's not, I want to know where he went. Mark nodded slowly. I'll look into it, but Grace, be careful. Vance doesn't like people digging around his past. Grace's gaze didn't waver. Neither do I, but I'm not stopping. Back at the hospital, Sophie stirred in her bed as Laya slipped her coat onto the chair. Ranger lay curled at the foot of Thebes, his breathing slow and steady. Ethan stood by the window, Phone pressed to his ear as Rachel's voice came through, low and deliberate. "I've started tracing contacts connected to that address. I think you're going to want to hear what I find next." For now, they had pieces. A. Scratch lock, an old complaint, a name with a shadowy past. None of it yet formed the whole picture, but the edges of it were sharp enough to know this. The girls had been left in the open far too long, and someone was still out there. Rain tapped lightly against the windows of the small conference room at the Mapleford Sheriff's substation. Rachel Bloom sat across from Deputy Mark Jensen, her laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting in her sharp brown eyes. She had traded her usual city suit for a dark wool sweater and a neat ponytail, but she still carried the air of a woman used to having the floor. Mark, in his pressed khaki uniform, leaned forward with a folder resting on his forearms, the muscles in his jaw tightening as they compared notes. "I ran his name through our system," Mark said, flipping the folder open to a grainy booking photo. The man in it had a long, angular face with a crooked nose that looked badly set from an old break. His thinning, dark hair slicked back. Carl Vance, 46. Multiple arrests, petty theft, trespassing, and one conviction for assault. Nothing that stuck for the bigger charges. Rachel scanned the notes. And the bigger charges, Mark's eyes were cold. Neglect of a minor, suspected abuse, intimidation of witnesses. In all those cases, the victims or their guardians dropped contact before trial. It's the same pattern. He gets close to vulnerable families, then disappears when the heat's on. Rachel's fingers tapped lightly on the table, and he was connected to the Hawthorne girls. Mark nodded unofficially. Neighbors say he was the one looking after them when their mother was working night shifts. From what I hear, looking after meant leaving them alone or using them as unpaid errand runners. Some people even heard him yelling at them in the street. Rachel shut her laptop. If he's back in town, we need to find him before he decides to tie up loose ends. Meanwhile, at Seaside Medical Center, Sophie had woken from her nap in a far better mood than anyone expected. The fever had subsided, her cheeks now tinged with a healthy pink. Ranger lay on the floor beside her bed, head resting between his paws, amber eyes tracking her every movement. Sophie giggled as she dropped a small plush ball from the tray table. Ranger picked it up gently and placed it back in her lap. "You like him?" Laya said from her chair, unable to hide Asmal's smile. "He's soft," Sophie replied, running her small fingers along the dog's thick coat. "And warm." Ethan, who had been leaning quietly against the wall, stepped closer. "Ranger doesn't play with just anyone, you know. I think he's decided you're family." Laya looked at him wearily, then back at her sister. The word family felt heavy, fragile. Ethan noticed the shift in her expression and after a moment sat in the chair beside hers. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "My daughter Emily. She was about your age when she—" He stopped, drawing a breath, his gaze drifting to the window where the rain traced thin silver lines. "She loved dogs too. She had a smile that could pull me out of the worst day, just like your sister's. But one night she got sick and we were too far from the hospital that could treat her. We waited and by the time we made it, it was too late." Laya didn't look at him directly, but her shoulders softened. "I'm sorry," she murmured. Ethan nodded. "I can't change what happened to Emily, but I can try to make sure nothing like that happens to you or Sophie." Across town, Grace Holloway had decided that her lunch break was better spent on Dockside Lane than in the hospital cafeteria. She carried a small notepad and wore a navy pica coat against the damp air. The first house she visited was next to the Hawthorne Rental, a faded green place with a sagging porch. A woman in her 60s answered, her hair pulled into a loose bun, eyes bright behind square glasses. "I'm Grace Holloway, a nurse at Seaside." Grace introduced herself. "I'm asking about the girls who live next door, Laya and Sophie Hawthorne." The woman's mouth tightened. Sweet girls kept to themselves. Their mama worked too hard for too little. But that man she left them with sometimes, Carl, he was trouble, yelled at them. I saw bruises once, but when I asked, Laya just shook her head. Grace jotted the words down. Did you ever report it? I called the non-emergency line once. Officer came by 2 days later, but Carl was gone. After that, I didn't see him for months. Grace thanked her and moved on to the next house, hearing much the same. Carl's voice echoing in the hall, the girls flinching, doors slamming. She returned to the hospital with her notes, Harasolve hardening. That evening, on the edge of Mapleford, Carl Vance eased an old pickup truck to a stop 2 streets over from Dockside Lane. He wore a dark hoodie under a frayed leather jacket, his unshaven jaw shadowed. From behind the steering wheel, he scanned the quiet block. He knew the Hawthorne rental had been left mostly empty, but the sight of fresh scratches on the front lock days earlier had bothered him. It meant someone had been there before him. He stepped out, keeping to the shadows, his boots silent on the wet pavement. As he neared the side alley, he muttered to himself, "Get in, get the stash, and get out." He wasn't after much, just the old jewelry box. He'd once seen the girl's mother. Hide away and anything else of value. But deep down, there was another reason. He'd heard whispers that the older girl was talking to people, and that was dangerous for him. From a distance, a curtain and a second-story window shifted. A neighbor's eyes followed his shape through the gloom, but the figure stayed still, hidden. Carl moved toward the back of the house, unaware that both Rachel Bloom and Deputy Mark were now building a file with his name stamped in bold letters at the top. Back at the hospital, Ethan returned to Sophie's room to find her curled up against RER's side, the dog's tail thumping lazily in. Approval. Leia glanced at him once, then down at the sketch pad in her lap, where she was drawing what looked like a lighthouse. Ethan sat quietly, letting the moment breathe. But in his mind, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. He could see the shape of the threat now, and the man who carried it. The rain had stopped by nightfall, but the streets of Mapleford still shone, with a slick black sheen under the street lamps. A damp breeze carried the tang of salt from the harbor and the faint creak of dock ropes shifting in the tide. At the far end of Dockside Lane, the Hawthorne rental loomed in partial darkness, its warped siding and boarded windows making it blend easily into the silence of the street. Carl Vance kept to the shadows, his hood drawn low, a crowbar glinting faintly in his gloved hand. He had been circling the block for nearly 20 minutes, watching for any sign of movement. His eyes, small and darting beneath his brow, scanned the second-floor windows for light. Seeing none, he muttered under his breath, "Still empty." In his mind, the girls were foolish enough to have returned here at some point, maybe even to sleep. And if they had left anything valuable behind, tonight was his chance. What Carl didn't know was that 2 miles away, Ranger was pacing near the door of Ethan's home office, ears flicking toward the north as though some frequency beyond human hearing had called to him. Ethan looked up from the laptop where he'd been reviewing a message from Rachel. "What is it, boy?" RER's head swung back toward the door, his body tense, tail stiff, a loud whine in his throat. In the next room, Laya stirred from the couch where she'd been curled under a blanket. "Something wrong?" she asked, her voice still hushed around strangers. Before Ethan could answer, Ranger padded to the coat rack, pawing lightly at Ethan's jacket. It wasn't his usual cue for a walk. It was sharper, insistent. Ethan felt a prick of unease. He clipped on Ranger's lead but didn't bother with his overcoat. Deputy Mark Jensen was just stepping out of his cruiser after finishing a late patrol when his phone buzzed. Ethan's voice came through low and urgent. "Mark, Ranger's acting like something's up near Dockside Lane. I'm taking him there now. I'm 5 minutes out," Mark replied. "Don't go in without me." Back on Dockside Lane, Carl crouched by the front door of the rental, the crowbar's flat end wedged against the weather-swollen frame. His breath came in quiet bursts, visible in the cool air. The metallic scrape of the lock's pins giving way echoed too loudly in the stillness. But Carl was focused. His eyes narrowed in anticipation. Ranger and Ethan arrived first, moving up the street with a steady pace. The dog's body was low to the ground, muscles coiled, nose working the damp air. As they neared the corner, Ethan spotted a shadow shifting against the porch light's faint glow. He recognized the slope of the man's shoulders from the photo Rachel and Mark had shown him earlier that week. Mark's cruiser rolled in silently, headlights dimmed. The deputy stepped out, his figure tall and broad in the beam from the street lamp. His presence shifted the air. The quiet night suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. Carl Vance. Mark's voice carried down the street, steady and commanding. Carl jerked upright, the crowbar still in hand. For a second, his instinct was to run, but Rare's bark, sharp, deep, and close, froze him in place. Ethan held the leash firm, the dog straining forward but controlled. Mark closed the distance, his boots heavy on the wet pavement. "Drop it!" Carl's grip loosened, the crowbar clattering against the porch steps. "I was just save it," Mark said, stepping onto the porch. He turned Carl toward the railing, his hands quick and practiced as he patted him down. From the inside pocket of Carl's jacket, Mark pulled a small velvet jewelry box and a dented silver lighter. "You planning on returning these to their owner?" Carl's face twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. "Don't know what you're talking about?" Mark wasn't smiling. He bagged the items along with the crowbar, his tone clipped. "Possession of stolen property, attempted break-in, trespassing. You'll have a nice list of charges by the time we get downtown." Ethan stood a step back, Ranger now sitting at his side but still watching Carl with unwavering focus. Laya, who had insisted on riding along once Ethan said Ranger needed to check something, peeked from the SUV's back seat. Her eyes widened as she saw the man, recognition sparking with a mix of fear and anger. She didn't speak, but Ethan caught the way her fingers tightened around the door handle. Mark glanced at Ethan. "Thanks for calling me in time. We've got what we need here." Ethan nodded. Ranger knew before any of us. Meanwhile, across town in her office, Rachel Bloom ended a call with Grace Holloway. Grace's voice had been steady but tinged with the frustration of someone who just confirmed what she already suspected. She had managed to obtain a copy of Seaside Medical Center's internal incident log, complete with time-stamped notes from the night Ethan brought Wyla and Sophie in. The most damning entry was attributed to Dr. Evelyn Sharp. No admission, no guardian, no insurance. Alongside that was Grace's sworn statement about witnessing Sharp's verbal order to turn the girls away, and a supplemental note from the receptionist, Paul Simmons, corroborating the sequence of events. Rachel laid the pages side by side on her desk. The legal weight of the documents was solid, enough for a medical ethics violation and civil liability. She picked up her phone and dialed Ethan. "We have what we need on Sharp," she said as soon as he answered. Grace came through. "With her testimony in the incident log, we can file for a formal complaint with the State Medical Board and initiate a lawsuit for negligence." Ethan glanced at Ranger, who was now settling in the SUV after the night's tension. "One less door to hide behind then," he replied. Rachel's voice was firm. "Exactly. This is the beginning, Ethan. We're not just protecting these girls now. We're building something that could keep this from happening to the next child left out in the cold." On Dockside Lane, Mark secured Carl in the back of his cruiser, the porch light glinting off the handcuffs. Ranger gave one last low rumble as if to mark the end of the night's hunt, then settled against Ethan's leg. Above them, the sky was clearing, stars beginning to puncture the dark like sharp points of truth waiting to be uncovered. The sky above Mapleford's courthouse was a deep winter blue, the kind that held the promise of change. Inside, the air was charged with a tense anticipation. Polished wooden benches groaned under the weight of townsfolk who had come not only for justice, but for closure. Laya sat beside Ethan at the plaintiff's table, her small hand curled inside his. Sophie sat on her other side, her cheeks now rosy with health, clutching Ariars's collar like a talisman. Judge Miriam Hale presided from the bench, her silver hair swept into a non-nonsense bun, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She was a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for cruelty. She cleared her throat, and the murmurs in the gallery fell silent. "In the matter of guardianship," she began, her voice steady but warm. "This court finds Ethan Cole to be a fit and proper guardian for minors, Laya and Sophie Hawthorne. Guardianship is hereby granted, effective immediately." She looked down at the girls, her gaze softening. "Welcome home, young ladies." Laya's lips trembled into a smile. Sophie's eyes shone, and Ethan's throat tightened. Ranger gave a quiet chuff as though he too understood the magnitude of the moment. Judge Hale's expression hardened as she turned to the defendant's table, regarding Dr. Evelyn Sharp. "For gross negligence and violation of medical ethics, you are sentenced to 18 months probationary supervision with immediate and permanent revocation of your medical license and a monetary fine to be paid to the victim's trust." Evelyn, pale and rigid, kept her eyes fixed on the table, her mouth a thin line. "And Carl Vance," the judge continued, her tone now edged with steel, "for child abuse, theft, unlawful entry, and witness intimidation. You were sentenced to 12 years in the state penitentiary." Carl's jaw tightened, his glare darting toward Laya, but Mark Jensen, seated nearby, shifted in his chair just enough to block his line of sight. The bailiff's hand rested on Carl's shoulder, ushering him out of the courtroom. When the gavel came down, it sounded like the closing of an old door and the opening of a new one. In the weeks that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly on a small house, perched near Mapleford's lighthouse, its whitewashed siding and bright red door, a cheerful contrast to the sea-worn cliffs. The windows framed sweeping views of the Atlantic, and a wide porch offered the perfect spot to watch the waves roll in. Laya and Sophie helped paint the bedrooms in pastel shades, one in soft lavender, the other in seafoam green, while Ranger patrolled the yard as if marking his new kingdom. 1 year later, the home was no longer new, but it was deeply lived in. A quilt draped over the couch, sandy flip-flops abandoned by the door, the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting from the kitchen. These were the details of a life rebuilt. Sophie's laughter rang out from the backyard where she and Laya were coaxing Ranger into, wearing a wreath of seashells they'd made. The town had not forgotten the people who'd made this happy ending possible. At the annual Mapleford Spring Festival, a stage was set up on the green. Grace Holloway, her chestnut hair tied back neatly, stood at the podium as the mayor spoke of her courage and standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. She accepted a plaque with humble gratitude, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found the girls who waved enthusiastically. Rachel Bloom took the stage next, announcing the creation of the Hawthorne Fund, dedicated to helping homeless and at-risk children find safe housing and medical care. Her tailored navy suit couldn't hide the warmth in her eyes as she spoke of turning personal outrage into a lasting solution. And then came Ariaris's moment. Wearing a polished leather collar with a brass plate engraved Mapleford's honorary hero, he sat calmly as the mayor placed a medal around his neck. The crowd erupted in applause, but Ariaris's tail thumped only when he spotted Ethan and the girls standing at the edge of the stage. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the lighthouse's beam swept across the darkening waves, Ethan sat on the porch with Laya and Sophie. Ranger stretched out at their feet. The wind carried the scent of salt and the distant call of gulls. Sophie leaned against Ethan's side, her voice soft. "Do you think Mom would have liked it here?" Ethan looked toward the lighthouse, its beam a steady pulse in the night. "I think she'd be glad you're safe and happy and home." For a long while, they sat in quiet, the sound of the sea filling the spaces between them. The house beneath the lighthouse had become more than shelter. It was a promise kept, a life reclaimed, and a reminder that even after the darkest nights, the horizon could still be lit with hope. Sometimes miracles are not sudden flashes of light from the heavens, but the quiet, steady hands God places in our path. People and even animals who step in when we need them most. In Ethan, Leia, Sophie, and Rare's story, the miracle was not just survival, but the gift of a family rebuilt from loss and fear. It reminds us that God's grace often works through ordinary moments. A stranger's kindness, a friend's courage, the faithful loyalty of a dog. In our own lives, we may pass by someone who is standing at the edge of their breaking point. If we listen closely and act with compassion, we might be the answer to their prayer. If this story has touched your heart, share it so others can believe in second chances. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of hope and redemption. May God bless you and your loved ones with protection, peace, and the courage to help those in